Hello my friends, welcome back. So, the Lady of the Lake. I think most of us probably have an image of the Lady of the Lake, which is in some sense derived from the legends of King Arthur and later retellings of that. For me, it's probably the film Excalibur, a very powerful image that I think resonates with a lot of us, even if we're not particularly familiar with the sort of Arthurian corpus, which obviously is mainly from the sort of Middle Ages, but based on earlier Celtic folklore and Celtic belief. So that's, I think, why this image of a sword emerging from a lake or being thrown into a lake resonates with us. In Celtic thought, in the Celtic imagination, bodies of water are gateways. They're portals to the other world, particularly if it's a lake in a wild place that's difficult to access. But it's lakes, it's marshes, bogs, rivers, the sea. We get this a lot in both the Celtic Iron Age in Britain and Ireland, but also in the Bronze Age in Northern Europe, much earlier, and also into the early medieval period as well. We're always dredging swords out of bogs or bowls or shields or helmets. These are given as votive offerings to the gods or goddesses of whatever lake and spring it is. So very interesting to see in archaeology and history this idea of the Lady of the Lake and the sword coming out of the lake reflected. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, though. What I want to tell you today is a Welsh folktale associated with a very specific place. And there's lots of ladies of lots of lakes in sacred places of Britain and Ireland. One of which I'm going to tell you today, and I visited this lake today. It's called Llyn y Fan Fach, which means the lake by the hill in Welsh. So in a lot of these stories there's a certain fairy lady and there's a sense of this votive offering as well. So I'm going to tell you this story now, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about the story. So stay till the end. There was once a certain young farm lad in Wales whose dad had died in the Anglo-Norman Welsh wars. So he was a lonely child and did some farm labouring, and it was a very, very easy job. All he had to do was graze his sheep on the slopes of the Black Mountains by the lake Llyn y Fan Fach. And he would take his sandwiches with him, and he would nibble on his sandwiches and just watch the sheep graze, and he would daydream while watching the shifting surface of that lake. Now, one day, he was walking along the side of the lake, and he saw, sat on a rock, this rock, the most beautiful young woman he had ever seen in his life. She was gorgeous, with long flowing dark hair and dark eyes. She was beautiful, and she was naked. Now this young lad, let's call him, I don't know, Daffyd, he just held out the only thing he had in his hand, which was a cheese sandwich, and he held it out to this beautiful creature as an offering. And she looked at him, took one look at the sandwich, wrinkled up her nose, and then leapt into the water and swam away. And just as she swam away, she turned and smiled at him and then was gone. Well, this young lad, Daffyd, he was spellbound and went back to those same waters day after day after day. And he would bring with him certain gifts, maybe a bit of bread or a nice piece of Welsh cheese, and he would keep going back. And sometimes that fairy lady would be there, sometimes she wouldn't, but he would always return with an open heart to the same place. And often she would be there. Sometimes she would be sat on that rock, sometimes she would be sat on the very surface of the water. because she was, of course, a lady of the other side. One of the Sidhe, one of the fae, one of the fairies. Now, he would always give her offerings, but she would usually turn her nose up at them. Either the bread was too hard or the cheese was too sour, but she would always give him a furtive little smile before disappearing beneath the surface of the lake. Gradually, he got better at giving offerings, did Dafydd. He would make the perfect, like a French baguette with a soft, gooey interior. He would trade a whole week's wages for the finest Welsh cheese he could get his hand on and the finest butter, and he would make a really nice cheese sandwich, hand-pick some cress from the valley, and he would offer it to this fairy lady. Eventually, he got the mix just right, and she accepted it and agreed to be his wife. And with that, she disappeared beneath the surface of the water, and then suddenly lights began to emerge from below the surface of the water, and the water opened up and outstepped a wizened druid of the other side, a fairy king from the kingdom that was below the surface of the water, with two, not one, but two beautiful young women. And this druid of the fairy realm, this old man, this magician of the lake, Llyn y Fan Fach, said to young Dafydd, "You have chosen to marry one of my daughters. Well, you shall have one of my daughters and a dowry of many, many, many cattle and sheep and pigs from my fairy kingdom beneath the waves. But there are two conditions here. First, you must guess which one of my daughters is the one you have asked for her hand in marriage. Second, you may not hit my daughter 3 times. If you hit her once, twice, 3 times throughout the course of your marriage, then the marriage is off and she will return to me." Fair enough, said Dafydd. He wasn't really in the game of domestic violence, even in this age. So he's like, I think I can manage that. But first, said the old druid, you have to guess which one of my daughters. And I'll be honest with you, Dafydd had no idea. These two fairy creatures were identical. And he was looking from one to the other, and they were both smiling at him. But then one of them just hitched her skirt up and wiggled her toes. And he was like, that one. And he guessed correctly. So, Dafydd was permitted to marry the daughter of the king under the lake. So she came forth, and she was permitted to take a dowry with her, which was as many cattle and sheep and pigs that she could count in one breath. But what she did it the old Welsh way that herders and drovers still do in some parts of Wales today, which is counting in groups of 5. So 5, 10, 15, 20. She counted many, many, many hundreds of sheep she counted before she ran out of breath. Sheep and cows and pigs and ponies, all from beneath the water. So they were very, very happy together in marriage, and they were very, very wealthy because the milk produced from these sheep was the sweetest milk in the valleys, the wool from the sheep was the softest, the flesh of the pigs was the tastiest, so they were very well off, these two. They could buy a nice big house. The young farm lad didn't have to do his farm chores anymore. He could move out of his mum's little cottage and they could get a place of their own, and they loved each other very, very much, and she bore him 3 sons that were very good looking and very clever. However, one day, many years later into this marriage, they were both on their way to a christening, and they were a bit late. They were in a bit of a hurry. So that farmer had went to get the saddle for the horse and trap, and because he was in a bit of a rush, he walked round his wife to saddle up that horse, and a bit of the trimmings of that saddle just thwacked his wife on the arm, and she went, and then she went white as a sheet, and she looked at him, and then he went white as a sheet. They both understood what had happened. One aspect, one hit had happened, even though it was an accident. "I didn't mean it," said Dafydd. And she said, "I know, my love, but it doesn't matter. 2 more times, 2 more strikes, and I will have to leave you." Well, you can be sure that farmer Dafydd was very careful not to strike his wife, even by accident, from that moment on. Many years of happy marriage later, they were going to a wedding. It was a happy occasion. They went to the local church, and there they were, sat up high, and the bride was going in, and the chorus was singing, and then everyone went quiet. The couple, the bride and groom, were about to say their vows to one each other. Everyone was in silent rapture and joy. And then Dafydd's wife, his fairy wife, just began to weep, uncontrollable sob, and everyone in the church stared and turned around to look at her, and Dafydd began to get very embarrassed and ashamed and just tapped his wife and said, "Oi, everyone's looking." And she looked down at where he had hit her and then looked at Dafydd, and then they both realised that another strike had taken place. Later on, Dafydd said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It was in the heat of the moment, but why were you crying?" And she said, "I foresaw great, great sorrows in this marriage, and although everyone was happy, it was a doomed marriage, just like our marriage will be doomed if you hit me one more time, Dafydd." Well, Dafydd was very careful for another few years, and they lived a happy marriage. But then one day there was a funeral, and Dafydd and his wife were mourning, and it was a relative, you know, it was someone that Dafydd cared for deeply, and they were lowering the body just of a small child into the ground, and everyone was quiet, and the fairy wife, she just started to laugh, just the most absolute, she was laughing her head off, she was just laughing for joy, and everyone was going, "Shh, shh, this is a somber occasion," but that just made her laugh even more. She was just giggling and then just bellowing with laughter, and Dafydd just gave his wife a tap, and she turned to Dafydd and said, "This is a happy occasion. A soul will suffer no more and is going to a better life. I can see it. And just as that soul is departing, so must I, my dear husband." And just there, right there and then, she walked out of that funeral, and she walked back to the farm, and she began to call, all by name, the cattle, the sheep, the pigs, and the ponies. All by their own names she called them, and they all followed her back to the lake Llyn y Fan Fach, and she walked down beneath the waters which opened up to allow her, and all those tens of all those herds, those great herds of sheep and horses and cattle following up the hill, up the mountain that I walked today, and down beneath the surface of the water. But there were many oxen were ploughing the land by various local farmers, because Dafydd rented his powerful oxen out to all the people of the village, and they all, with their ploughs still on their backs, went up the river and into the lake, and the ploughs behind those yoked oxen carved a great gash in the landscape that is still there today. It's now a river running from the lake Llyn y Fan Fach all the way down the side of the hills. It's not quite the end of the story, though, because although Dafydd never saw his beloved again, though he went back to the side of that water again and again and again, some connection had been lost. But his three boys, they grew up to be very, very wise physicians, herbalists. It's said by the local people that that's because of the fairy blood that runs in their veins. And some say that sometimes they and their descendants will go to the lake Llyn y Fan Fach, and their fairy ancestor or fairy mother will come out and continue to give them education in the herb and plant charms. And this part of Wales is very well known for its rare botanical species of flora, and many of these medical remedies were put into various monasteries and libraries, and we still have them today. So the descendants of Dafydd, let's call him, and the fairy lady of the lake, Llyn y Fan Fach, are still around today in this part of the world, and way into the medieval period, the area was renowned for its great physicians that were of fairy blood. So that is the story of a lady of the lake, an example of some of the Celtic folklore rooted to place, rooted to specific lakes, which later Arthurian Lady of the Lake mythos undoubtedly springs from or carries in its DNA. But what about the meaning of this idea of the Lady of the Lake? Psychologically, for me, because we see this sort of thing in a lot of Celtic folklore, the idea of courtship with the other world. And sometimes there's the giving of gifts, and there's some sort of communication with a usually female entity that represents the other side, perhaps the spiritual dimension of life. And this is something where sometimes I think the supposed beliefs of our ancestors kind of resonates with a lot of new ideas today, perhaps in contemporary paganism, but also in kind of the new age thought and this idea of manifestation. So, for example, in I think it's in Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist, but I've heard this idea quite a lot stated by some people, that the idea of synchronicities in life, that the universe might be conscious and guided. So this almost starts to represent or resemble the animism of our Celtic ancestors, where every lake and tree and river has an animating conscious principle that can be interacted with, but is usually hidden behind a veil. So this idea of synchronicities, where sometimes the universe just puts little coincidences in our path as little signposts that perhaps we're on the right path in life, or things to kind of pay attention to. And some people say, and I think Paulo Coelho states this in The Alchemist, once you stop paying attention to those synchronicities, they stop coming. So in a way, that idea is contained for me in this story, I think, in some kind of way, because of this idea of first courting the Lady of the Lake, but then doing something 3 times. You've got to be a bit of a dunce. That's almost the idea of shutting the other world off, and then those clues, those signs from the other world stop appearing, and Dafydd can't make that connection with perhaps the spiritual side of himself anymore. That brings me back to the legends of King Arthur and this idea of votive offerings. This idea of throwing sometimes your most important item, your sword, into a lake, sacrificing that. In these early medieval and Celtic and Bronze Age societies, your sword is your sense of identity, it's your sense of self. To lob it into a river, to sacrifice it, is like throwing yourself away. It's getting out of the way. It's giving a sign to the gods and goddesses, or the universe, if you like, that you are willing to sacrifice your ego and listen to whatever signs might come. Again, that might be a slightly contemporary way of looking at it, but I have a funny sort of feeling that a lot of the worldview of a lot of our ancestors has a lot of resonance with a lot of thinking today, even in the scientific worldview. You think about ideas around panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental principle of reality. This idea would not have been alien to our ancestors, where there are conscious animating principles behind everything, and this idea that the universe itself is alive and gives us clues as long as we listen to them. And that idea, I think, is contained in this Celtic folktale about this lake. But there are many other lakes and many other Celtic folktales where this idea is present in them. One of which I could tell you now, if you wish. It's from the Irish Finn cycle, the stories of Finn McCool, and it's called Dermot and the Daughter of the King Under the Waves, which has a lot of resonances with this folktale I've just told you. So I'll play that video, or I'll put a link to that video now. As always, my friends, do please give this video a like and a subscribe if you're not subscribed already. If you want to support me personally, you can always follow me on, subscribe to my Patreon account. I'll put details below. Thank you very much, my friends. See you again soon.